The idea that there's some sort of monolithic Israeli response to the Hamas terrorist event on the 7th of October is simply untrue. And there are many Israelis who are protesting against their government, who are begging their government to put the hostages first. And yet at the same time, the international community is somehow failing to recognize that supporting the State of Israel, supporting the State of Israel's right to defend itself is not, does not mean that we cannot call the State of Israel to a ceasefire. We cannot beg the State of Israel to pull back from its siege, because the siege is fundamentally wrong. The siege is not defending itself. The siege is attacking another country, another state. I'm not quite sure how to define the Gaza Strip. And the Hamas fighters killed 1,700 civilians and soldiers in its 7th of October attack. Israel has killed apparently 7,000 people, many of them, 40% of them, children. 4 hostages have so far been released. This is not, I've said before, this should not be a balancing act between two groups to see who has suffered the most, because it doesn't even itself out. One death is too many. But Israel has to acknowledge the calls of the people who are directly involved in this conflict, whose parents, whose grandparents, whose daughters, sons, nephews, nieces, grandchildren have been taken hostage and are in the tunnels under Gaza. They have to acknowledge that, bring them back. And it's absolutely essential. What Netanyahu's government has done is 2 things. Number one, it's alienated a great swathe of the international community that was entirely behind and entirely supportive of Israel on the 7th of October. Number 2, it's made it, I suggest, increasingly hard to get back the hostages who've been taken. Apparently 50 of them at least have died in the bombing attacks conducted by Israel. It's impossible not to think of the hostages. It's impossible not to think of those civilians who are suffering because of Netanyahu's response, but also because of his failure to provide proper protection in the first place, and his failure, and the failure of the right-wing governments in Israel since the beginning of this century to seek a peaceful resolution with the Palestinian state. The fact that Hamas has rejected the 2-state solution does not mean that that is license for Netanyahu and Bennett and the others simply to ignore it. It's still supposed to be the plan on the table. Instead, Netanyahu and the other right-wing governments that have taken office this century have effectively condoned and encouraged the settler movement across the West Bank. That must be wrong, and they must be pulled back. They must be pulled back, no matter what the spurious religious claims that they protest. And, by the way, those religious claims that they protest are very deeply rooted in the Talmudic scholarship that many of the settlers embrace. So it will be difficult. But these people have been enabled by a succession of right-wing, foolish governments from Israel. And gradually, the mood in Israel is hardening. Is hardening not in preparation for a ground offensive, is hardening against Netanyahu. Now, is that likely to produce a softening of his position? I really don't think that's the natural outcome, unfortunately. A government which is under pressure from its people is more likely to act decisively, I think, is the discreet and accepted term. So it means other governments from across the world need to talk to Israel about the range of possibilities. And our government needs to be among those. Maybe they are. Maybe they are back-channeling vigorously at the moment. Now, the Labour Party needs to work out what its position is. It is not incompatible to demand a ceasefire and at the same time to support Israel's right to defend itself, because the siege of Gaza is not self-defense.